what we have started in 1971 is an economic business model based on we are going to rely for GDP growth on not only more people at work, not only the increasing productivity of people, but also on ever higher debt, every year spending more money than we have. When you start that game, the only way you can keep the world playing that game is if you make sure that the interest rates go down. Because if your debt is increasing every year and the interest rates increase after that, it's game over.
Welcome to the GoldRepublic Podcast. My name is Bart.
And I'm Alexej and In our weekly podcast, we invite guests from all over the world to get valuable insights
into the emergence of a new monetary system through the lens of precious metals, cryptocurrencies, and other financial instruments. Welcome to a new episode of the GoldRepublic Podcast. Today our guest, a very distinguished guest, friend of the show, I might say, Edin Mujagić. Edin is the chief economist of OHV Wealth Management, and he is the author of Turning Point 1971, the new book about that crucial year. Edin, can you tell us a little bit more about, well, first of all, if you want, yourself, but secondly, that turning point?
It's a very important year for us because there were a couple of things happening in 1971 which have had enormous consequences in the 50 years since. And one of those things is the decision in the US taken on 15th of 8th, 1971. And that's the decision to sever the link between the US dollar and gold. And the consequences of that decision, we have felt those every year since 1971. But there are more things because this week we have seen in the news that the Chinese Communist Party is having its 100th birthday celebration. So it's not from 1971, but 1971 is very important because in that year, the US has decided to re-establish diplomatic relations with China, which have never been in place since 1945. So you can say that starting in 1971, the doors for China to join the rest of the world have been widely opened, and China joining us all, becoming the factory of the world, that in itself has had large consequences for us all as well. So 1971, very, very important year.
Turning Point 1971 was written by you in response to a very friendly relation that you had with, well, I think the last great central bank president, Paul Volcker.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience in dealing with Paul Volcker as a man, and also maybe a little bit more about his decision making around that period?
Well, let me just start by taking you back to 2007, 2008. We all know what has happened in 2007, 2008. And for me, it was reason enough to write an email to him, just asking him, basically, could we meet? And I was expecting that there is a very low chance he would even answer my email, let alone say to me, sure, come on over. That is exactly what has happened. I get an email with him saying, fine, if you want to talk to me, let's go. So I went over there in June 2008,
Where did you go?
Time, New York, to meet him for, initially I thought 15 minutes, nothing more. I think we ended up talking to each other well over an hour. And since 2008, I think there has been 1 or 2 years we haven't met, and all the other years I flew to New York just to speak to him. And one of the reasons is, yes, he's the legendary chairman of the Fed. He's the guy who became the chairman in 1979 with the task of to beat the extremely high inflation rate in the US, the consequence of the decision in 1971. But his role is much more broader, because before he became the chairman of the Fed, he worked at the US Ministry of Finance, and he was actually the guy who suggested to Richard Nixon at the end of the 60s already, and certainly in 1971, to sever the link between the US dollar and gold. So he was the guy who came up with the proposal. He was the guy who then had to clean up the mess at the end of the 70s, and he was the guy who, ever since he left the Fed, really was trying to make changes, because the consequences of the decision in 1971 were not the consequences he was hoping for.
So maybe it would be useful for those who are not maybe as much knowledgeable about this period to kind of go through when more or less that Nixon shock started. So obviously Bretton Woods was the laying foundation of the pegging of the dollar to gold, and up to the 70s, but also right before there was an oil shock. There was in that same period there was an oil shock in 73, 2 years later as well. Right before there was Vietnam. That led also the US to spend and create deficits on the expense of pretty much every other person who would exchange gold towards the dollar. So perhaps it would be good to talk first about that period and then analyze and give an overview about that.
Let's try to make it as simple, as concise as possible. In 1944, in July 1944 actually, on the 1st of July, well over 700 people from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods. And 3 weeks later, after conferencing and negotiations, they have come up with the Bretton Woods system, which was in place since 1944 up until 1971. And at first, it worked really well. At the end, something had to be done, and when you ask yourself where did it go wrong, there are two things you have to keep in mind. First, the economic world, which was in place in 1944. In the 60s, it was really changed. So you cannot have a system developed in 44, which in itself didn't change a bit, while the surroundings where the system is a part of has been changed and has been changing all the time. So that's the first part. The second part is that the role of the US was crucial in the Bretton Woods system, and the crucial part was the US had to find discipline to prevent itself conducting policies which were not in line with what has been decided in 1944. And that means you should not spend more money than you have as a government. And for a long time, it worked really well. until late 60s, when two things happened. The Vietnam War, which costs lots of money the US didn't have. And the second part is that's the period where the US started to create a social welfare state in the US, which is a good thing, but it also costs money. When you try to do that and at the same time you engage in a war, it's really hard to discipline yourself to not print the extra money you need. And the US wasn't able to keep itself from printing money. And when they started doing that in the 60s, the rest of the world was kind of asking, wait a second, you have a fixed amount of gold and you have an ever-increasing amount of US dollars. And the cornerstone of Bretton Woods was every country was allowed to exchange its dollars for gold. It works fine as long as the balance between how many dollars are there and gold is kind of stable. When, as the US did, when you start printing more dollars, other countries started to ask themselves, well, suppose I want to exchange my dollars in 2 years' time for gold, will there be any gold left? So that's the moment where they started, not because they distrusted the US, but just as an act of precaution to exchange their the dollars they had for gold. And when you have lots of countries, and at the end almost every country doing that, the system is dead. And that is what has happened in 1971. And the role of Mr. Volcker in it is, he was actually saying to Nixon, look, this is the situation we are faced right now. Lots of countries do not have trust in us, so they are exchanging their dollars for gold. And as a consequence, the supply of gold we have is decreasing. So we have to do something to stop that. And the only viable thing they were able to come up with is to say, well, as of 15th 8th, 1971, you cannot exchange your dollars for gold. That's the decision, and that's the reason why they've done that.
And so why have you decided to write a book that is entitled by the same name?
Yeah, because I think it was some 6-7 years ago, I started to put some graphs and to look at them. And what I noticed is that all those graphs started behaving very oddly in 1971. So the natural question for me was, what's happened in 1971 and why do I see what I see? So my book is a kind of journey to why 1971? Why did they in the US say, as of now, you're not allowed to exchange your dollars into gold? And then, and that's the most important part of the book, what are the consequences of the decision they've taken? And when you delve into it, then you see that the consequences are numerous, and they are they have been there every year since 1970. So 50 years later, we are still feeling the consequences of the decision in 1971. For me, that's more than enough a reason to write a book about it.
And to come back to Volcker, because that is the key, one of the key people who in that process was involved in decision making, and if you had the chance to talk to. So how does he describe, what were your conversations about with Paul Volcker, and how did he basically explain back then the reasoning of his decision that you partly already explained about the gold window.
Yeah.
But then later on to hike interest rates up to, I think, 20%.
Yeah.
To calm down that rampant inflation that picked up heavily in the 70s.
Yeah.
Because he made two key decisions here. One was initiating the response of the later one. Mm-hmm. What was the process and what did he share with you?
Well, he was the guy who was really, well, let me say it this way. When he got a meeting with the president of the US in 1979, he was there at the White House, and he said to him, if you nominate me to become the next chair of the Fed, you should know that as soon as I am able, I'm going to hike interest rates. And he left the White House thinking, well, that was my shot to becoming the chairman of the Fed, but there is no way he will nominate me because I just told him I would do exactly what no president liked to hear. The interest rates will go up. And yet he did get the job. And one of the reasons why he got the job is exactly because he was so, because he said what he would do. Don't forget, when the inflation rate is 15% in the country, and when you are faced with stagflation, as in the 70s, even as a president who don't like to hear the words interest rates will go up, you are faced with the reality, and you know that doing nothing to conquer the inflation of 15% hurts even more. Mm. So that's the reason why he got the job in the first place. And then, even then, after you have gotten the job, you have to have the guts to increase the interest rates to 20%. Because what we are doing when increasing the rates to that level is you are creating an artificial recession. That he knew that was the only way I can beat the high inflation rate. And I think it was in one of his first hearings in the parliament that he said, ladies and gentlemen, listen, the living standard of us all in the US has to come down. When you think about it, you have a guy saying, if you put me in charge, I will make sure your living standard goes down. He's saying to you, I'm going to make you poorer. Mm-hmm. But he's frank and honest about it because he's saying, I don't like making you poorer, but it's the only thing if we want to beat inflation.
That makes you poorer.
Yeah. That was the only way, and he was very frank about it. And he did it at the end of the day. So in those years, while he was the Fed chairman, he was unpopular because millions of Americans lost their jobs because of him. I think there was one time just before the Christmas, I think 1980 or 1971, there was one guy who managed to enter the building of the Fed armed, and he was looking for Volcker to kill him. So the pain was immense in the US. So while he was the chairman of the Fed, he was unpopular. But after he left the Fed, and after he beat the inflation, and he laid the ground for enormous GDP growth since 1987, till his last day, he was one of the most respected economists in the world. Whenever, anywhere in the world, somebody needed a really independent somebody to conduct an investigation or something, they all knew who they have to go to, Mr. Volcker. When the UN decided to try to find a solution between the Swiss banks and the children of the Jewish people who didn't survive the 1940, 1945, they needed a guy who was above everybody else, who was independent as hell. There was only one guy, Paul Volcker. He was really one of a kind.
So you've had the experience of course, like spending a lot of time with him at multiple occasions. What in the last sessions or the last moments when you visited him, could he say about the development of what he's seen from basically the turning point until he's also seen obviously the 2007-2008 crisis, the Euro crisis? He passed away unfortunately in 2019.
2019, yeah.
When the last times you visited him, what were his insights and takes on where we are in his view, what he regrets as well?
He was extremely worried about the place of the US in the world, because, as he said it, I grew up in a world where the US was leading nation, but leading by showing what's responsible policy. And a part of the problems we see in the US, but also here, is linked to not the decision in 1971, but the consequences of the decision. And one of those consequences is, starting from 1971, every central bank, including the Fed, was able to print more money than ever before. So basically, every country in the world could spend more money than it had. And when you first start doing that, it's fine, because you use the extra money to put down a new road, new factory, something that is useful for the country. But after 40, 50 years, you're faced with a high amount of debt, which has to be paid back. So he was the guy who said in 1971, this is what we have to do. There is no other way to solve this problem. But everything that has happened since 1971 was completely different than what he was hoping for. So when I asked him in 2018, if you were able to go back to 1971 and to do it all over again, would you do it the same way as you did in 1971? He said yes, because at that point in time, he said, there was no other option. But what has happened since 1971 is the governments in the US, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter, they have misused that. They have misused the possibility to spend more money than you have. And spending more money than you have every single year after 71 has consequences at the end of the day.
It's just a fascinating story, and Paul Volcker, being the really independent man, I think maybe he hoped or thought that people would be more like him in his thought process and not abusing the possibility that he gave them when it comes to severing the bond between gold and the dollar. We can still see, like you write about in your book, and you talk a lot about the crisis of 2007 not being over yet.
No.
Can you expand on that? And there is one measure that central banks have taken, well, at least in Europe, that I'm fascinated about, and that is negative interest rates.
Yeah.
Can you link negative interest rates to 1971? And how is it possible that we accept something as crazy as negative interest rates?
There are many things you can see right now which you can link directly or indirectly to 1971. Let's talk about this. Negative interest rates now and the decision of 1971. Can we link those two? Yes, we can. And let me show you how. What we have started in 1971 is an economic business model based on we are going to rely for GDP growth on not only more people at work, not only the increasing productivity of people, but also on ever higher debt, every year spending more money than we have. When you start that game, the only way you can keep the world playing that game is if you make sure that the interest rates go down. Because if your debt is increasing every year and the interest rates increase after that, it's game over. Because the load, the amount of interest you have to pay over your ever increasing debt makes it impossible to go on. So it's crucial to make sure that the interest rates go down. When you start this game at 20% interest rates, thanks to Mr. Volcker, that means you can keep playing that game for a long time. Because when you start at 20%, the floor is at 0. And you have a lot of time before you get from 20 to 0. When you look at the graph of the Fed rate from 1979, you see a fascinating thing. And the fascinating thing is every time the Fed lowered interest rates, the lowest point was lower than the lowest point before. And every time they started increasing interest rates, the peak, the highest point, was lower than the highest point in the previous time they increased interest rates. So when you look at the graph, you see the trend going down. And as I said, when you start that game at 20%, you can keep playing it for a long time, 50 years. In 2008, we have reached the 0 point. Now, when you reach the 0 point, that means in a normal world, game over. Because you cannot decrease interest rates below 0. At least we thought you cannot decrease interest rates below 0. What the central banks did then is started quantitative easing, so buying bonds. You can look at quantitative easing as buying bonds. You can also look at it as another way of decreasing interest rates. So, in fact, what they've designed is a way to get around the 0 interest rate floor. Now, we are now in a situation where you have a number of central banks, including the ECB, who have actually decreased one of their key rates below 0. Not very far below 0, but still below 0. Now, the interesting thing, in my view, is when I was doing research for my book, I came across a number of papers written by the International Monetary Fund in 2019, and you can go to the site of the IMF. You can find all those papers. It's in the open, and in those papers they are first explaining why in the future we might need deeper negative interest rates. And then they are explaining the design, how to reform the international financial system to make those negative interest rates possible. So it's all about not concluding that the game we were playing has stopped. No, it's all about finding a way how to keep playing the game. And the only way, as I said, then and now, is the only way you can keep the game going on is if you find a way to decrease interest rates even lower. And we all said when you reach zero, it's game over. Well, it's not, apparently.
Is it theoretically possible to go -10? And are there social consequences that...
As of now, no. Because if you were to say now that the interest rates will go to -5%, I think a lot of people would react by going to the bank, getting their money and going back home. So no, that's not possible in the system as we have it now. But if you look at the papers written by the IMF, then you can see that it is possible to redesign the system in such a way that you make it possible to go to -5%. And one of the key things you need in that new system is the introduction of the digital money by the central banks. So there is a paper actually in 2019, again, not by somebody, I don't know, just IMF, writing that there is a need for central banks to start issuing digital dollar, euro, etc., as a way to make negative interest rates in the future possible. And it is not a coincidence that when you look at how the central banks were talking about digital currencies before 2019 and after 2019, I mean, it's wow. Before 2019, there was hardly any central banking talking about digital euro, digital dollar, etc. And if there was one of two, they were saying, well, there is no need for it. We are not going to do that. And as of summer 2019, the same time those papers by the IMF became published, you see the tremendous increase in the number of interviews and speeches made by central bankers about digital dollar, digital euro. And now you have a situation where 4 years ago, 3 years ago, hardly any serious central bank was even thinking about introducing digital version of their currency. That was 3-4 years ago. Now we are in a situation where you have at least 50 central banks, among them all the important ones, thinking about when and how to introduce the digital version of their currency. Such a change in 4 years' time, I've never seen anything like it.
It's and now it's 2019. COVID hit, end of 2019.
Yeah.
So either way, if you want to go into a conspiracy hat mode or into the other way,
yeah,
it was good timing because contactless payment, all of that.
All of this, all those papers by the IMF, all of this was happening before COVID. So it has nothing to do with it. The only thing COVID might have caused is that the need for change has been made more prominent, but it was not the cause of it, because all of those things I was talking about were playing before the virus hit us.
I'm not saying that those two are. It's just very good timing, and either way, everyone is free to think whatever they want to believe in. But so that whole situation of having negative interest rates in your bank account will then be. You have to sell it to the population, right?
Yeah.
You have to somehow tell the people what is the benefit for them to have solely digital currency that is deposited at the central bank for them to own in the first place.
Yeah.
Panetta, who's one of the directors of the ECB, has recently said that he has said two things that caught my attention. The first thing he said is that the ECB, the European Central Bank, is the only entity, is the only institution that is 100% riskless in the economy, quote unquote, end of the quote. Number one. Number two, he said that fiscal policy and monetary policy, so one policy is basically done by the government and the other one by the European Central Bank, can work together. And for me, it means not work together, but can be combined and coordinated, whereas one is supposed to be independent and the other one proper, in the case of the European Union, which is a bit more complicated than United States or China, owned by every member state.
Yeah.
What does it tell you, and how do you see that?
When you take some time to look into the economic history and monetary history, I'm sure you would reach a conclusion that the most terrible and most frightening sentence you can hear is, let's join forces, monetary policy and fiscal policy acting together. Almost every time that has happened in the past, it has not solved anything, and it has caused more problems. And that lesson was one of the important reasons why in the 80s, all over the world, every country decided to make its central bank independent. Exactly to prevent monetary policy and fiscal policy joining forces. Because if the central bank is not independent from the politicians will always misuse the fact that the central bank can print money without any limit because of the decision in 1971. So in the 80s we've said, look, there were only two countries in the 70s that have not had high inflation. The US, 15% inflation. There were two countries in Europe where the inflation rate was 5-6%. Switzerland and Germany. So what they did in the 80s, they have looked at Germany and asked themselves why? What is so different in Germany that they have only had 5% inflation per year? And they learned that the difference, one of the differences between Germany and the rest of the world is the German Bundesbank was independent. Meaning that when German politicians asked the Bundesbank to decrease interest rates and to print more money because in the short term it would be a wise thing to do, the German Bundesbank, being independent, was able to say to those politicians, yes, it would be a wise thing to do looking at the short term, but we look at the long term. And in the long term, it would be the foolish thing to do. So they didn't do that. Now, in the 80s, we've learned. In the 80s, we've said, well, if that's the case, let's make sure that every central bank is independent, not only in Germany. And that is what has happened. And that has been the case ever since, up until since 2008. Because what we are seeing right now is de facto central banks being independent on paper. But when you look at what they do, and when you look at the reasons why they do what they do, then it's becoming even more challenging to keep saying that they are truly independent. Because in my eyes, they are not. So that's the one of the biggest changes of the last years has been that central banks are less independent than they have been in the past. And the sentence coming from a central banker, by the way, saying let's join fiscal and monetary policy, the way I see it is just basically using different words to saying from now on we are a part of the Ministry of Finance because we will do what the Ministry of Finance asks us to do.
And let's just put it for those who, like, just put in context, is people who are not elected, who can make decisions that influence millions, hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah.
In the way they basically transact with money,
the
savings and all of that together.
The fact that central bankers were never elected officials was a very important and very good thing when they were independent. It becomes something completely different when they are not as independent as they used to be. And that's the reason why I'm saying the sentence, let's join forces, monetary and fiscal policy, basically boils down to saying we, the central bankers who have had the task to look not only at the short term but long term, from now on we will do as the politicians do, and we also will look at the short term. And the only thing I'm saying based on the study of history, monetary history, is it has never been a wise decision in the past, and I don't know why it would turn out to be a wise decision now.